Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of Courageous Leadership Academy Live. If you're new to the channel, my name is Dr. Kelly Waltman, and on this channel, we talk about pretty much all things leadership. Focus a lot on communication and how to lead effectively, but we also tackle topics like, getting over the fear of looking at your financial statements. So all kinds of things, leadership, we talk about on this channel. And I love this series, especially these live interviews, because it's a chance to really showcase the work that other people are doing as well and help us round out our leadership skills. And today we have the pleasure of talking with Sarah Judd Welch. Slow down, Kelly. She is the principal and CEO of Sharehold, an innovation consultancy that designs and fosters belonging with teams and communities navigating change. As a community and organizational designer, she believes that it is our collective responsibility to create environments and cultures in which everyone is seen, heard, and valued. Amen. Could not agree more. Sarah is Dare to Lead trained, and most recently, she led the research report, Redesigning Belonging, How Uncertainty Magnifies Belonging at Work. And that's one of the big things we're going to talk about today is unpacking that research and just talking about belonging at work and how uncertainty, which we faced over the last year, how that impacts that. And her clients range from Google, Anheuser-Busch, to the Skoll Company or Skoll Foundation and Meetup. So without further ado, let's bring Sarah Judd Welch into the broadcast studio. Hello,
hi, Kelly.
welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So is there anything else that you would like to highlight about the work that you do at Sharehold, just your work in general, anything else that you'd like to share with people as an introduction?
I think you covered it.
Try to be thorough, but I always like to offer that up as an opportunity. So the one thing I forgot to mention is how you and I came to connect. So we have a mutual colleague, friend that Sarah had the pleasure of being a podcast guest on there recently, someone to tell it to, and connected us. And I'm so glad that Tom and Michael did connect us because we had a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to diving into that today.
Me as well. I'm so glad that Tom and Michael introduced us.
Yes, agreed. So, one of the things in the intro, we talked about that you did this recent research on belonging. And I think it's helpful to really start at the most basic level and talk about what does that mean? How do you define belonging? Like, it sounds kind of basic, but I think that that's an important thing to establish.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we often toss around this word belonging. It's almost become like a buzzword within corporations and within common culture today. Like, even if you look at Airbnb, their tagline, belong anywhere, like, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Most people do have an innate sense of what it feels like to belong. When you ask people, like, what does it feel like when you belong? They might say something like, I feel seen, I feel heard, I feel comfortable being myself, I see myself reflected in other people. So there's a lot of different ways to describe belonging. Though in Sharehold's research on belonging, we're really focused in on one particular definition of belonging that was defined in earlier research that was conducted in the 1990s by academic health researchers. And this defined belonging in two different parts. One is valued involvement. It's the experience of being seen, heard, and valued for who you are and what you're able to contribute to the group. And what is called, I'm going to use in quotes, fit. So the idea of fitting in and that what you're able to contribute fits within the needs of the system. I think that latter half, the definition of fit, is this is often where the controversy around belonging can sometimes come in, like the idea of fitting in and how that can feel like a really negative experience at times. So it's really about just like aligning what you offer to the needs of the group. So for example, if your team needs data science skills and you have data science skills, your skills fit within the needs of the team. So it's not necessarily as fitting in, but just that you have an alignment between the needs of the group and what you're able to contribute as an individual.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because first when you share those two definitions, I think valued involvement, I think is what you said.
Mhm.
And that I was like, oh yeah, I really like that a lot. And yeah, at first there's almost this, yeah, kind of a negative connotation to the second definition. But as you elaborate, I really like that a lot. And I think about it like we feel like we have a place. So we're
Yeah.
fitting in, and we have to fit the specific mold and be like everybody else, but that we feel like we have a genuine place within
Yes,
the culture. And that's I
exactly.
like
Like you are able to contribute in a meaningful way.
yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah. I'm curious, like, how, is there anything that you would add on to that? Like, what does belonging feel like to you? And in your work, how do you hear people talking about their experiences of belonging?
yeah, I think I have tended to veer more towards that initial definition that you share
Mm.
in the sense
Hmm.
of feeling seen and heard and having that valued involvement. Even though I haven't used that specific terminology before, although I think I will moving forward.
That's a win.
Yeah, yeah, feeling that your contribution is valued, feeling that
Mhm.
yes, that it's that using the not defining the word with a word, but feeling that you belong, that you're accepted, that you are valued, that you're seen for who you are. Um, and yeah, that your contribution matters. That is a key piece. And we talk a lot about when you're cultivating a culture, having that collective buy-in and having that sense of
Mhm.
everybody has a place at the table. And so those are some of the things that in the work I do and in the conversations I have and thinking about belonging, what that all means. But I love that you gave me some new terminology today.
I like the words you used around collective buy-in
Mhm.
and people having like a shared, oh, I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but something about people coming together around a shared sense of, what was the phrase that you just used?
I'm not even gonna
It
remember
was
what
so
I
perfect
said.
that it just like escaped my brain immediately.
Yeah, that's yeah.
But a lot of our work at Sharehold is about bringing people together, like very
Mhm.
disparate stakeholders. Like we're often working across very complicated groups of stakeholders in our
Mhm.
innovation work across communities and teams, and making people feel seen, heard, and valued, or that they belong at the nexus of whatever it is that we're building is
Yeah,
really critical to moving any kind of innovation work forward.
absolutely. Yeah, and
So
that's
building that co-ownership is important.
yeah, so that's yeah, step one. That's yeah, for sure. And that's kind of a good segue to one of the next things I wanted to talk about is, why belonging is so important. Why it's crucial that we're having this conversation, that belonging is so important, and what are the consequences when people don't feel like they have that sense of belonging. So kind of the two sides of that coin.
Yeah, well, for one, belonging is a basic human need. It's like the equivalent of like water or air for our psychological or social experience. So it's something that like we need as human beings from a very intrinsic, innate level. So if you don't experience belonging, the psychological and social impact of that can be quite devastating. And we've seen that play out more recently over the past 2 years with the loneliness epidemic. And we are seeing that magnified in real time throughout the pandemic that we're experiencing, with so many of us being isolated and the resulting mental health crisis. So we know how important and critical belonging is to every single person, not just at work, but just in life at large in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what do you see within organizations if there is if in general people are not feeling that sense of belonging? Like, do you see have you seen examples of kind of agency wide what that means, or within an organization, what happens when people generally don't feel like they belong?
The first thing that will happen is that employees will disengage.
Mm,
They're not showing up at work ready and willing to dig in. They're not excited. They're like checked out of their jobs.
mhm.
That's like one of the first things that you'll see if an employee is not engaged. But also, there can be a sense of conformity, which is the opposite of belonging. It's like when you're like speaking to that negative connotation with the second half of the belonging definition of fit. It's when you are really emphasizing fitting in, So you're
Mm.
molding yourself to whatever it is that the group, like the group attributes, and you're not really being your full self. You're not bringing your full self to work. So conformity is definitely the other side of the coin there, where belonging perhaps goes too far, where you're so desperate to belong that you are giving up parts of yourself. But there's also a pretty significant business impact for not belonging. There was a really fantastic study published in HBR about a year or so ago that talked about how a company that invests in belonging can save up to $52 million a year. And that's in reduced employee turnover and reduced absenteeism, and in increased engagement. And that's for a company a size of about 10,000 people. So it's like quite a significant cost savings. So if you want to think about that in the opposite, what happens when we don't belong is like we're leaving a significant amount of money on the table. You are leaving a lot of employee productivity on the table.
Mhm.
And we're hearing a lot of our clients at Sharehold begin to think about belonging in those terms. It's about employee well-being, employee productivity, and ultimately that driving job performance and profitability and business growth. And I hear that conversation like that's absolutely true. And at the same time, I also feel a little scummy about it,
Right.
because belonging is such like a valued human need. And like, why are we
Right.
talking about this in terms of dollars and
Right.
P&L when like we know this is something that we innately need? And I think that just speaks to the global and societal context that we're currently in and that we work under the United States, which is, capitalism.
Yeah.
So if we can zoom out a little bit, I would say like we shouldn't be talking about the business case, but yes, in the context of our society and our work environment today, like it is about profit.
Yeah. No, you're spot on. I completely agree. I end up having that same conversation frequently with people, but in talking about communication and feedback. We know
Mm,
that some of the research shows that almost everybody, 98% of people want feedback and they crave feedback, and they will fail to be engaged if they're not receiving it. But in the most recent Gallup State of the American Workforce report, less than a quarter of people report receiving feedback, meaningful feedback from their managers, and being supervised and receiving feedback in a way that motivates them to do exceptional work. And
mm,
I have the same conversation. I say you should want to have positive communication and give feedback, because that's what motivates your team. They feel valued, they feel inspired. That's just the right way to go about leading, is for all of those other reasons. But if those aren't good enough for you, then understand there's very similar research that you were just stating about the significant financial loss that occurs when there's not effective communication and when team members aren't engaged. And also the flip side, when there is those companies that are labeled effective communicators have 2 times higher returns than
yeah.
those that are not. So it's very, it's kind of a nuanced approach and measuring
Right.
those
Well,
components.
why aren't
Yeah.
managers investing in effective communication and feedback? Like, what's holding them back?
So some of it is people are afraid of feedback. They're afraid to give and
Here.
receive it. And because we tend to fear it, and some of that goes to our natural fight or flight instinct, survival instinct from millennia ago, when we were our
The
standing within
reptile
the tribe.
brain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, our standing within the tribe literally determined whether we survived or not. And so that's still hardwired in us, that when we start to give or receive critical feedback, we have this very visceral response. So because we fear it, we avoid it. And because people have tended to fear it, we don't really see it role modeled a whole lot. Like, some people are lucky and they have a leader that really will do that, but a lot are not. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that fear piece and that discomfort. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that comes up in belonging as well.
absolutely.
I think a lot of leaders, well, I would say it's probably two parts. Like, there's probably two big buckets of reasons why companies are not leaning into belonging. One is definitely fear. It's like the discomfort of the
Mhm.
conversation of having to acknowledge, like, you as an individual might have contributed towards someone not belonging, or general discomfort of around the topics that contribute towards belonging. And there's so many different factors that tie into belonging, ranging from like mental health and benefits to work-life balance, but also there's a huge diversity, equity, and inclusion component. And many leaders just feel really uncomfortable broaching that conversation.
Mhm.
And they don't feel equipped to have that conversation. But in addition to that, the other reason why they're not having it is sometimes leaders do not feel that that's their job or their responsibility. And what we saw in our research from last year is that it is absolutely leaders' responsibility to lead in regards to belonging. If it's not being prioritized at the top of the organization, it's not happening across the org.
Right.
And in fact, some of our research participants, they said when we asked them, if you had a magic wand and you could do one thing to improve the sense of belonging within your organization, what would you do? One person flat out said, I would fire all my executive leaders and rehire them. This was someone who like worked in HR and recruiting for her firm.
Wow.
And I thought that was like such a strong statement and spoke to how powerful and how much power executive leaders have in shaping a culture of belonging inside of their team.
Absolutely. Yeah, wow, that is really powerful. That's it's also sad, but,
But
but
true.
true, yeah.
Another research participant told a story about how they were reviewing their quarter's employee engagement data. And one of the data points came up about do you feel that you have a friend at work? And this person who participated in the research, and she participated anonymously, she is a C suite executive. She said that her CEO said that employees having a friend at work was not his problem, that it was not his job. And I think that you would say, Kelly, I imagine, is that any executive leader, like it is absolutely their job to make sure that their team has what they need. And if we know that employees need friendship, friends at work, and a sense of belonging at work to do their best jobs and to
Right,
be whole people, it is your job as an executive leader to foster that.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's tempting for people to, maybe say, "Oh, well, yeah, it's not my job to make sure you have friends," to kind of put it in that way. It's like, well, that's not what we're talking about. Having a friend at work, and you can correct me in the definition here if I stray, but it's not about, oh, this is now your quote unquote best friend and the person that you're going to socialize with all of the time. And no, it's not a leader or manager or executive their job to, yes, make sure we have quote unquote friends. It's about having an ally at work, somebody that you have that trusting relationship with, you have that connection with, that you feel connected to.
Hmm.
And that is absolutely their job to make sure that
Yeah.
people feel that they have those relationships
Yeah.
at work. Yeah. Yeah. That's powerful. Um, is there more, either from this most recent research project that you've done or from other work in thinking about, the current landscape of belonging within our society? And certainly a global pandemic does not help things. Um, yeah, but what else, if we had to kind of paint a picture of what the current landscape of belonging was or is
Mm.
right now, what does that look like?
I think that's a really good question because there are various threads or camps, so to speak, if you will, across the landscape of belonging. As you mentioned in my introduction, I'm dearly trained. Brene Brown speaks a lot about the concept of belonging. She speaks specifically about the concept of true belonging,
Mm,
which she would describe as, I believe, like the ability to I think she describes it around like the concept of self-acceptance, so that the more you can accept yourself, the more you can belong elsewhere, and that you will only belong as much as you have self-acceptance. So that's
right.
really focusing on the idea of self-affirmation, self-narrative, self-esteem, and that's one specific camp of belonging. There's also like the business context around belonging. There's like the buzzword of belonging, like putting it in the bucket of like community building and culture, which is like a really just like soft, fuzzy, like wanting people to feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that camp of belonging, I would say, is very I don't want to say woo because that's not quite the right word, and I feel like that really diminishes it. But it's really just more about the like label slapping of things. Like there probably is like a lot of substance there, but it's very much glossed over. It's used as like a euphemism for like happiness
Mm,
and warm feelings. Uh,
right.
not very well defined or strategized, and there's not a very clear, like there's not deep thought about it. And then there's also a growing conversation over the past year in the landscape of belonging of racial equity and diversity, equity,
Mhm.
inclusion in the workplace and systemic racism.
Right.
That's like a very loud, active, and very valid camp that we should all be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
One thing that we learned in our research is that belonging is an outcome of DEI. So you cannot prioritize belonging within your organization and building a culture of belonging without also addressing DEI. And I would say that it's also true for any type of community, not just a team.
Right.
So that's sort of like where we see the landscape of belonging. So there's the idea of true belonging, a self acceptance. There's like the wishy washy, feel good version of belonging, like the buzzword. And then there's the conversation around DEI and racial equity. And I would say like the way that we think about belonging is, I don't know. I don't want to say that we're in a different camp entirely, but we are definitely in a more nuanced place, I would say,
Okay.
based on our research. What we saw in our research was, which was like a surprise for us to learn, is that through the different conversations that we had over the course of 2020 about belonging, um, well, first, let me back up a little bit. So first, like our research focused on like how does uncertainty impact belonging? And like the very short answer to that is that uncertainty magnifies the experience of belonging. So whatever it is that you're feeling in regards to belonging, you're feeling it much more intensely. And
That's
so
interesting.
in those more intense experiences, we were able to get much more nuanced conversations about belonging.
Mm,
When like something feels so much more amplified and stronger and magnified, you're able to articulate it much more deeply and see it much more clearly. And so, with everything that we saw over the past year, over the course of 2020, with constantly escalating types of uncertainty from the beginning of the pandemic and shelter in place orders and mass shifts to work at home, um, then like moving into the summer of 2020, you know, the end of May, the murder of George Floyd, and then there was protests across the country, and then there was like the upcoming election. Like the types of uncertainty that we experienced in 2020 was just truly unprecedented and just
right.
magnifying every single day. Like every day you're waking up and there's something new happening that
Right.
we couldn't avoid. And so that experience of like really intense uncertainty
Yeah.
created really intense belonging experiences, both in the affirmative and in the negative as well. And with those intense experiences, we articulated four different types of belonging that people spoke about: foundational belonging, personal belonging, group belonging, which is typically what we talk about when we talk about belonging, and then societal belonging. So I would say our where we fit into the landscape of belonging is probably just a little bit more nuanced, and I would say we're neither here nor there. We're just
Okay.
more reporting it as it is.
Yeah, that's wow, that's interesting. I sure I had thought about it on some level, but I don't until you said it that way. I don't know that I really truly grasped just how many layers of intense uncertainty we experienced last year. I probably maybe because it would have overwhelmed me at the time to
Yeah.
think about the enormity of it all. But yeah, looking at it in that retrospective, um, yeah, it really was such an intense time, just over and over and over again. And so it's interesting, it makes sense, but it's still very interesting finding what you said that whatever level of belonging we felt was magnified, and that makes sense because there were just one after the other, these experience, that sense of uncertainty just was magnified by one after the other.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was a tough year.
Yeah.
In summary. And I think we all felt a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that what prompted you all to take this on as a research project? Was there kind of one catalyst moment, or what was it that prompted you to decide to do this research?
Well, we started doing this research in 2019. So in probably like 2017, 2018, belonging sort of coming up in our work. A lot of our work involves community building and innovation and organizational design. And our clients kept using the word belonging to describe both the process of shareholders' work, like your process creates belonging within our team and within our community, but also they are often desiring this outcome of belonging. Like, we want to build a scalable sense of belonging across every location of our co-working space, for example. And, we just started leaning in and being like, what specifically do you mean by belonging? Because like the word community, it just started to become this word that people were just throwing around. And so we wanted to get much more specific about what belonging means. In 2019, our team sat down and started going through the existing research on belonging, both as an effort to just simply understand, but also because, design research and research in general is really part of Sharehold's strength of capabilities. It's something that we really thrive at. And we felt that there was probably an opportunity to do some custom research around belonging that would bring value to not just one client, but many of our clients and even many people beyond. So we went through the existing research on belonging and found some really interesting trends and insights. And very quickly, we narrowed in on the area of belonging at work. And the reason for that was there's a few different reasons. One, like there's an existing body of research around belonging at work that is very rich. So we could build upon existing research and contribute towards an existing body of work rather than starting from scratch, which is quite daunting. Yes. But two, also during that period of time, we were increasingly becoming more involved in organizational design projects. Whereas previously we mostly focused on community design projects.
Okay.
Just closer and closer, we were seeing that in order for our clients to be effective in community change, they often needed to look internally to change themselves first.
Makes
and
sense.
So we were increasingly focused on that specific area of work. And so we felt that this was like a great toolkit to have in our belts to pursue belonging at work research. And then three, culturally, it just became an increasingly part of an interesting conversation and more relevant. So in 2020, like many teams, we had grand plans that totally changed. We were going to launch a research project around benchmarking belonging. Okay. We wanted to survey and do research with a wide swath of companies, from like nonprofits and big tech companies, small businesses, around what does it look like to belong in this type of organization and to create like an industry standard benchmark of belonging. And then COVID happened, and we all know how things change so dramatically. And we realized that an effort to benchmark belonging in such abnormal times was just a fruitless task. Like, we wouldn't be able to create any sort of benchmark or normal level of like all of your data would just be so skewed because of all of these events that were happening. Right. So we quickly just shifted focus and we're like, okay, like this is what the current environment is. We still want to pursue this research. What is the most relevant question for us to ask right now? So we decided to focus on uncertainty. And initially, we thought that our research would result in a body of work that focused on remote team building and working from home and how that impacts belonging. However, as the different types of uncertainty just magnified and we continued on, we realized that there was much larger topics to cover within the uncertainty landscape. So we did find interesting data points about the impact of remote work on belonging. Remote work definitely does have an impact on belonging, and our research found that belonging generally decreased by 5 percentage points. And that specific data point was mirrored in research also conducted by Slack over the same time period. So we feel really good about that data point.
Right.
However, there are much bigger factors in belonging experiences, and that has to do with more diversity, equity, and inclusion, general group dynamics, and like mental health was a really big topic within our research, and management experiences and executive leadership, and simply being a good manager and having a good manager can have a really big impact on belonging experiences. So remote work was definitely a factor in our research, but it simply wasn't the biggest one.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Was there anything else that like really surprised you in the findings? Anything that
you know, I think the thing that surprised me the most in our research was these articulate definitions of the 4 different types of belonging. We didn't go into this research thinking that we would come up with, I think this research just went so much further and so much deeper than we ever anticipated. And we didn't anticipate that we would identify like a framework for understanding belonging. Like we just went in with the definitions of belonging and we're like, okay, this is what belonging is. And then what we heard was significantly more nuanced. And that's not to say that the definitions that we came up with, the 4 different types of belonging, conflict with existing definitions of belonging, but I think provide a much more nuanced perspective. So like going back to that Brene Brown definition of true belonging, what we heard in our research is that true belonging is very much of an aspiration and an ideal, and it is not the experience of majority of people in their jobs today. And that is from a combination and confluence of a variety of factors. One generally is people, when you are like a rank and file employee, maybe like an entry level job, you are not self-actualized as a person when you're like 22, 24. And that's also the same can be said for people that are like the same age as us, Kelly. Like we're not self-actualized people. Like there's so much more that I feel like I can do and achieve, and so much more personal growth that I have to do before I can say that I'm like truly self-actualized and I fully accept myself. You know, I'm working on it with my therapist, but and there's some people who are very, very successful who do experience true belonging. And Brene Brown focuses particularly on executive leaders. And there are many executive leaders who are leading in the C-suite across public companies, really large organizations, who maybe have had that experience of true belonging. And they're truly able to show up as themselves and be themselves. But that's not the experience for the majority of people. And I think there's also a significant amount of privilege and white privilege in someone who experiences true belonging. So we heard in our research that privilege has a huge impact on people's belonging experiences. And our research really showed to those of us who benefit from white supremacy of like what role that plays in belonging experiences. So that was a topic that came up very frequently in our research. And that was something that, I mean, I thought that it would come up, and I thought that it would be something that our team would synthesize and like narrate over, but it really surprised me just how many of our research participants directly mentioned white supremacy and systemic racism in our research interviews. That was something that really surprised me that, I didn't anticipate that.
Just like how strong of a narrative that was.
Yeah. That
is interesting. And so did you see, you know, in terms of those interviews and those conversations, that it was a very strong narrative? Did you, I don't know if you had, you know, if you did quantitative analysis to see, like, did you see any significant differences based upon, you know, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation? Like, did you see any differences there, or was that not something that you really like measured those differences?
Well, our research method primarily focused on research interviews. So we do in our design process, in our research process, we break up our quotes into and put them into database, and we code them and do what is called frequency counting. But because research interviews are rather limited, they are representative, but I wouldn't say that we were able to see across 20 interviews what the patterns might be across race or sexual orientation.
Right.
We were able to see in some of our survey data a few trends in that regard, but I would say that we probably would want to do more quantitative research in order to synthesize that. Though I think what was really interesting is that between the 4 different types of belonging, anecdotally, we saw that those who participated in our research and were people of color really focused on their personal sense of belonging in order to compensate for a lack of other types of belonging. So going back to that 4 different types of belonging: foundational belonging, personal belonging, group belonging, and societal belonging, we see those 4 types of belonging as being interdependent. And I know I'll just spell them out what they are, because I haven't actually defined those. Foundational belonging is really the transactional level of belonging. Sorry, there's a siren behind me in New York City. Foundational belonging is really that transactional level of belonging. It's that your needs are met in regards to how you need to show up. So this gets into the idea of work-life balance, benefits, addressing mental health needs, acknowledging mental health needs, acknowledging that as a person, you are a human being who has needs that extend beyond the work office. Like, Kelly, you are a whole person outside of how you show up at work. You have a family, you have other relationships, you have other things that you're balancing, you have personal projects you're working on, and you are a whole person with dignity and agency. So that's what we mean by foundational belonging. It's really like the base level layer of belonging. That's really where we should be starting. Like, everyone should have that, but not everyone has that at their job, which is wild. Like, just the other day I was reading how Amazon is introducing these overnight shifts that are like 10 hours or something like that, from like 1 a.m. to 11 a.m. And workers were pushing back against that because they're like, how am I going to spend time with my family if I'm not there? So that's where foundational belonging comes in. It's like really about the bare bone basics of meeting people's needs and treating them with dignity and respect. Personal belonging is much more aligned with true belonging that Brene Brown speaks about. It's the idea of feeling connected to yourself. There's self-affirmation of the value that you bring to the table. You see and recognize yourself. You know how you contribute. Group belonging is typically what we talk about when we talk about belonging at work. It's really about the group. So like belonging in relationship to other people. And this is about how you contribute, how you participate, who you recognize and reward, who you promote. And when it comes to your job, it's about like making sure that everyone has a clear way to contribute and that you are recognizing people for their contributions and that there's a clear path forward that ideally aligns with their personal goals and their personal sense of belonging. And then societal belonging, there's been a huge conversation in 2020 about, do we talk about politics at work? And we saw in our research that the experience that people are having out in the world absolutely impacts how they show up at work and how they belong at work. So societal belonging is that what's happening out in the world will influence how you belong elsewhere. So if you don't feel that you belong within society, that's going to impact how you show up and how you belong at work. And these 4 areas are all interdependent. And what we saw in our research is that for the research participants who do not feel that they had strong senses of societal belonging or group belonging, were often overcompensating with personal belonging. So it was like out of necessity. And we also saw the reverse was true as well. For some people who had really high group experiences of belonging, they weren't necessarily investing in the same way in their personal sense of belonging.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's like when you say it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But until you really hear it and you hear it defined that way, and you hear people's experiences, it's easy not to truly get it. And so I appreciate you sharing that, both the definitions and those interesting findings, because again, I think it's so important that we articulate these things, because otherwise even though they might sound like, okay, it makes sense, it doesn't mean they're common sense because we don't
Yeah,
necessarily, think about it. It's not the front of our minds, and it's essential to articulate that and really understand it. I think just generally as humans, I think it helps us be better humans, but also particularly as leaders,
hmm,
understanding how essential these different facets of belonging are and how important that is to effectively support your team.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's key. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, we didn't anticipate that we would come up with these four different types of belonging through our research. So I think that in general is just a surprise. And as you know, and you've probably have spoken about so many times, Kelly, like you're not able to take action or improve an element of your work unless you're able to name it.
Yes.
And some would say like you can't manage what you can't measure. And what we were able to do with the four different types of belonging is create a tool to visualize measurements of belonging across the four different types and show how they're interrelated in a visual map.
Yes.
So that's been really interesting. And we've begun to take that framework into live workshops with clients to, in real time, assess teams' belonging experiences and visualize what that experience looks like, and use those maps to identify next actions across the four different types of belonging. So each type of belonging is sort of correlated with specific areas within that impact belonging experiences, and you're able to take action on them. So I think that was probably the most surprising part of the research, is just how much further it took us than we anticipated.
Yeah.
And it allowed us to become much more articulate and specific about belonging experiences. And by naming them, it allowed us to begin to create a model for visualizing and measuring belonging and then taking specific actions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's that's worth weight in gold right there. Yeah, that's great. So having now these findings, what are some recommendations that you can give to, again, just in general, so we can be self-actualized individuals, but also so kind of general recommendations, but also for leaders, what are some recommendations that you've found from the research that you can give to people?
Yeah, this is an area that I feel is a little bit contentious because I really want to say like these are the five things you need to do.
Right.
However, many of our research participants were very, very what's the word? Strict with us. Like they were very much like, we want you to know this. Um, they were very clear that it's not like a one size fits all type of strategy. Like you really need to do the work to understand what belonging looks like within your organization so that you can take action in a way that's really specific to you and your team.
Mm,
So our research left off with two different recommendations that are a little bit more generalized, and then it does go into a little bit more specifics. But generally, one, if you are an executive leader or an employer, just simply begin by recognizing that you have truly immense power to shape belonging experiences, both within the nature of our society today and the role that work plays in our lives. We spend a third of our lives at work. Your employees spend a third of their lives with you as an executive leader and
right.
as their job an employer. And one thing that we didn't really talk about today was like the trade-off between belonging experiences for like job security, for example. Like we're in a relatively insecure job market. And because of that, there is this tacit, or even some would even say like a very explicit power dynamic where some people feel that they might have to conform or
Mhm.
trade off their experience of belonging for job security. So
Right.
just begin by recognizing that as an employer, you have um, immense and an oversized power in shaping belonging experiences. And as soon as you can recognize that power dynamic, you can begin to address it and unpack it and distribute that power. But you can't do that until you first recognize it. The
Right.
second thing that we would recommend is more for everyone, both for employers and also for employees, is just to recognize that, with employers shaping such an immense part of our lives, we might want to invest our identity elsewhere. So these two recommendations are actually in tension with each other. Employers do have immense power in shaping belonging experiences, but that might not be the ideal experience. Today, employers are one of the primary organizing social structures within the United States, particularly with the decline of civic and social institutions. And we need to ask the larger question of, is that the world that we want to live in going forward? So like tactically what that looks like is like make sure that your team has the resources and time off that they need so that they can foster and cultivate their lives outside of work, and can really foster their personal sense of belonging and belong to other groups as well. And thirdly, I would probably add on to that is that, as an employer, you need to take some steps in advocating for your employees as well, particularly those who might have marginalized identities, whether those are known, unknown, or seen or unseen. If we recognize that societal belonging comes with us into the workplace, it is an employer's responsibility to take action on that. And not only do they have the responsibility, but they have the power to do so.
Right. Yeah, I love that, as you shared those, that there is this overlap, because we are a whole person. We aren't, while we might compartmentalize parts of our day and or our weekly schedule, we can't truly compartmentalize who we are as people and individuals, and understanding how those different types of belonging, how they are interdependent, how they are woven together. And you can't just separate one from the other and think that, okay, how you feel you belong, your sense of belonging in society isn't going to affect how your sense of belonging at work, and or vice
because
versa.
work is a social institution.
Right, yeah. And so, yeah, being willing to recognize that and the importance of that, and as leaders, to respect that, as you said, to respect that's the reality. And I think some leaders might tend to say, oh, well, yeah, that's not my responsibility.
But it is.
But it is. Yeah, but it is. And just like, when you have a toxic work environment, and you don't feel like you belong at work, that carries home. It's not like that person, when they leave the door, they magically, that sense of,
That's a good point.
not belonging.
Anybody who's had a bad boss knows
Right.
how that sticks with you, like on the weekends, and you're
Yes,
thinking about it like 9 p.m. at night when you're like washing your dishes.
exactly.
The
You're
reverse is
probably
also true.
right. Yeah. You're probably venting to your partner or your other family member or somebody. And that weighs on you. It weighs on, how you feel about yourself and how you go about your day and how you move through the world. So yeah, the converse is going to be true. And so for leaders to recognize, and coworkers to recognize the significance of that and to show up for each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah. Are there other things that leaders can do to help cultivate a culture of belonging within their agency?
Yeah. The one tactical thing that came out of our research, which was again more about understanding the current context of belonging rather than specific solutions thus far. I think that'll be the next stage of our research, is looking at solutions. But one solution that very quickly bubbled to the top was the role of listening in fostering a culture of belonging. A lot of organizations today implement employee engagement surveys, pulse check surveys, and whatnot, though those are perceived as being very superficial. So what we heard from our research participants was to engage in listening practices that are significantly more active and responsive as well. So like making it a regular practice as an executive leader to sit down with people on your team and even people beyond your immediate team on a regular basis across all different types of employee groups, so that you really have a pulse on like what people are feeling and what is going on. But beyond that, making sure that you report back to the larger team of like, hey, this is what I heard across 5 different conversations. this is what I'm going to do to address this, and then make it happen. There was a really interesting model that came up through our research around civic organization and civic engagement. The name of the model is slipping my mind at the moment, but it's this idea that when you engage in civic participation, you begin at the lower rungs of pacification. Like you're just listening to like be like, hey, I'm listening to you, but it's not necessarily genuine. And as you move up the rungs of the ladder, the types of listening that you're doing are becoming much more responsive and participatory, where you are engaging in deep listening, you're taking what you're hearing and making plans with it. And then as you move up the rungs of the ladder, you are co-creating with the people in which you are engaging in listening practices with. And that's sort of how you want to begin to think about listening within your organization as well. When you are listening and designing for belonging experiences, as much as possible, make sure that your listening practice is engaging and that it is additive rather than extractive, and that you are bringing those employees into the process of designing specific solutions. So it's really about listening, responding, and then taking action. So you really need to like make a commitment to what you're hearing and make a plan of action to accomplish that. And then report back on like this action, this is what we learned, this is what worked, this is what didn't, and invite participation in that process.
Yeah, I love all of that. And, you know, especially just drawing out what you said about engaging the team members in that process of, you know, coming up with solutions. That's,
and I do want to caveat that you don't want to task your employees, particularly your BIPOC employees, with coming up with solutions on their own. That's not the intent there, but you do want to invite them into the process and allow people to step up and participate as they feel willing and able. And if your organization is doing some sort of formal organizing around it, consider paying those employees for being on a special committee, if you will, for participating in that process and being a leader in that way.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. I'm glad you specified that. I completely agree. And now I just lost my train of thought. So wrapped up in your response. Yeah. I love what you said also about in terms of listening and then and taking action. You know, certainly for people to feel like they are a valued member of the team, of the group, it's not just enough to listen. That's a key place to start. You know, if people feel genuinely and truly heard, that in and of itself is huge. You know, if you're feeling like you're actually being heard when you share your experience, but that's not the end. You know, that's a key piece. And when I work with leaders, I say all the time to ask, those targeted open-ended questions. Ask something so you want to ask those open-ended questions, but you want to do so in a targeted way. You don't want to just say, so how's it going for you? Because you may or may not get a genuine response. But if you can say, and this doesn't necessarily apply just to belonging, but what are the biggest challenges you're facing right now? What are you getting from me that you find helpful, or what aren't you getting from me that is helpful? What can we do to make your job easier? What, some of those, so they're open-ended, but they're semi-targeted. Yeah, that you're more likely to get a genuine response. And I would think doing some of those types of questions as well, at trying to get to the heart of how much someone feels a sense of belonging within the organization and without, would be a beneficial way to start that dialogue. And that even just the act of being heard would be a powerful first step.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's no better way to make someone feel seen than to actually address their concern.
Yes. Yeah.
To build a program or a product that reflects them in their specific challenge.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other kind of top don'ts and or do's for people to keep in mind? Any parting words of wisdom here?
I would say do act with humility, and have compassion for yourself as well. I know for myself, sitting in on our belonging interviews last summer were, for me personally, very hard. And I found myself like second guessing like our team and being like, oh my gosh, like now I can see how I really messed that up. And it was like a very challenging period of time for me just to like go
Right.
through those interviews. And so as an executive leader, like take accountability, but also have compassion for yourself. It's
Right.
going to be hard, and commit to doing the work. And then beyond that, I really encourage all of us who have teams to talk about politics at work. And I know that can be a little taboo in some circles, but we heard in our research that when you're not talking about politics at work, that when you're not addressing the current political environment, like for example, today, as we're talking through this, there's an impeachment trial happening. When you're not mentioning those things, you are denying people's reality at work and beyond work as well. So I think that's like a really easy thing that companies can begin to do. And of course, like you can create your own policies around it, around like what kind of conversation is okay versus not okay. But I really encourage workplaces to begin to develop that policy and habit of talking about current events. So yeah, talk about politics at work, be kind to yourself, take responsibility. Those are the ones that are top of mind for me.
I think those are great. Those are, yeah.
Is there anything that you would add?
I think, the biggest one, yeah, for me, just circling back to, when you said about the listening and being willing to ask those tough questions and being willing to, yeah, to sit with the answers and, receive that feedback as a leader. Like you said, they are going to be often uncomfortable conversations, but being willing to go there and sit with that discomfort and use that as a mechanism to move forward. I think those would be one of the top do's,
Yeah.
from my
To
perspective.
learn from it.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I would add is, I think it's really critical, and not just to open the conversation, but begin to measure and track belonging.
Yes.
So that you can begin to take action on it. And that's part of the reason why we developed this belonging assessment, is so that we can help our clients begin to do that as well. So if anybody listening is interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me about belonging assessments. That's something that we'd be thrilled to chat about. But certainly, you're not able to take action on something if you don't understand it. So
Right. Yes.
Get clear, engage
Yeah.
in the conversation, measure it.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So I will put links to your website and contact information in the video description when this lives on for replay. But I always ask guests, can you let people, where can people find you on social web?
Our website is sharehold.co, and we are at shareholdco on Instagram and on Twitter. And we also have a really fantastic newsletter that we typically send out weekly. We're currently on pause for the beginning of 2021, but we'll restart it soon. And you can find that in the footer of our website.
Awesome. Yeah. And I would definitely encourage folks to reach out to you both, yeah, for the newsletter, but yeah, for, your research and those assessments. That's a great resource and tool. So,
and you can also find the free version of the research white paper on our website as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This was a great conversation, very informative and enlightening, and just a true pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I appreciate you inviting me onto your show.
Yes, thank you. And good luck as you continue to share this information and work with agencies. We wish you all the best.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.